Good morning. My name is Carol Hine. We're at the Taneytown History Museum on March the 10th, 2018. I'm here to talk with Lois Smith about her remembrances of growing up in Taneytown. Good morning, Lois.
Good morning, Carol.
Would you like to tell us about your family and early days of your remembrances of Taneytown?
Certainly. My name was Lois Hitchcock Smith, and my parents were Lena Angel and Fern Hitchcock. Both of them were raised in this area and around this town. I don't know if they were born in Taneytown, but they lived here. They married and moved to York, Pennsylvania, where I was and my two siblings were born. I was the youngest of three, and when I was 2, my grandmother Hitchcock passed away, and we came back to Taneytown, and we stayed with my grandfather for a while. Now, he lived in a big house on Baltimore Street here, and he was a veterinarian. The house had 5 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, a dining room, a big foyer, downstairs and upstairs, an open staircase, and also his office, his veterinarian office, was in the back of the house, attached to the house. I remember lots of things there, but the most thing I remembered is there was a dumbwaiter in a pantry. And my cousin and I used to ride up and down on the dumbwaiter. And also I was allowed to play in the attic. Now the attic was huge, and I particularly remember an old spinning wheel that was up there. And also there was a big water reservoir which was not being used at that time, but there was a big wooden water reservoir in the attic. And this house had a turret room, and I was allowed to play there, up in the attic. And I remember they had whole bunches of bananas hanging up there to ripen. I spent many an afternoon up there. Eventually we moved away from my grandparents and went to live right outside of Taneytown. And I remember my mother driving a Model T Ford, which is the only car she ever learned really how to drive. And she worked in the post office as a clerk in the Taneytown post office. This is when it was uptown next to Bumgardner's Bakery. And my father was a barber.
Lois, can I interrupt you just a
Sure.
minute? Let's back up just a minute.
All right, yeah.
Here's a picture of the house that Lois was just talking about. It was located where the Exxon Station is now. When her grandfather sold the house, they sold it to the American Legion in Taneytown. So the American Legion was there for a while, and then it was sold, and then it was demolished, and the Exxon Station built. Actually, it was a city station at first. So sorry I interrupted you.
That's
I just
okay,
wanted to
no.
point out that we did have a
This
picture.
is where I played, up in here, in that room.
And this was the stable behind.
Yeah, that was the barn.
Okay.
And sometimes I went with my grandfather. Since I was the youngest at that point, I didn't get to go with him too often, but I remember going with him several times to make calls on farmers to take care of their animals.
So you drove in a car?
Yes, we went in a
Okay.
car. Yes, we went in a car. And his brother was also a veterinarian in Woodsboro. We eventually moved a couple of different places in Taneytown, but we eventually ended up on Middle Street. And that's basically where I grew up. It was a different era and a different time. No one locked their doors at night, ever. You knew everybody in town. You knew where everybody lived. And we were permitted to play on the whole street. We used to play kick the can in the middle of the street in the evening, which was a game of hide and seek.
Oh.
And if you could come in and kick the can off, you were home free. And in the winter, we had lots of snow, and we used to slide on Middle Street. There weren't many cars at that time either. And also over on Baltimore Street, we would slide. Also, no, York Street, I'm sorry, York Street. We'd go down that big hill and end up way down below well, outside of the city limits.
Oh.
Then we'd have to trudge
Oh.
back. But it was a nice time. It was a very calm existence until World War II came along. I remember at that time my father had worked for Mr. John Leister at the hotel, and he ran the bowling alley also that was up there in Taneytown. And I remember when Pearl Harbor Day, hearing it on the radio that we had been attacked. My brother went into the Navy, joined the Navy, and my father worked at the shipyards in Baltimore during those years. He stayed down all week and came home on the weekends. He stayed with his brother who lived in Baltimore. I was very attached to my father, I guess being the youngest one, and he took me with him lots of times. And he said I could ask more questions than anybody he ever saw. I remember going to the creamery, which was up here in Taneytown, one time with him to do, I don't know what he went there for, but I remember the big sheets of dried milk coming over the rollers.
And that's the old buildings behind Country Kitchens.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And my father liked to play cards. And when he had time, he'd go to the hotel up there, which was owned by John Leister at that time. And he and a bunch of men would play pitch. And I would sit in the big windowsill and watch them play while they played. I remember, and he was very interested in baseball because he played baseball as a young man until he hurt his shoulder. So he was the coach for Taneytown baseball team. We played baseball on Sunday, the game, and then we played it all week at our house. We replayed it. I remember we went, every Sunday evening he would walk up to the hotel or drive up to the hotel and get a quart of ice cream. That was our treat for the week. We also went to the Opera House, which is no longer there. And I remember when Happy Johnny was at the Opera House, and we went there at Christmas because we got an orange and a small bag of candy, which I guess was given to us by the town. I really don't know who provided this, but we got this every Christmas. We had a movie theater, and I remember there was a sewing factory that was in operation over it, but I was allowed to go to the movies when I was older. I could go on Saturday morning, and they had a player piano that played The Bear Went Over the Mountain every Saturday morning. There was not much difference in the music ever.
And that's right on the square.
Yeah, that's on the square.
Where the Chinese restaurant was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you had the opportunity to visit the old jail.
Oh yes, I attended what's called the United Brethren Church, which is still on Middle Church, but now it's the United Methodist Church. And the old jail was behind the church. And since I lived on that street, I was all over the street. And we used to climb up and look in a little window that was near the top of it. It was all made out of tin, I guess. And we never saw anybody in it. But we had one police officer, and his name was Cutie Horn. He did not have an office or anything, but he was the law and order for Taneytown.
I don't think he had a gun either, did he?
No, I think he had shot a man one time, and he said he'd never carry a gun again. But he had law and order. And
Lois and I were talking this week. We think the population of Taneytown at that time was probably in the 800 or 900 range.
yeah, something like that, I guess.
It stayed pretty stable around there until I think the 80s when the population exploded in Taneytown.
But then during the war, I remember the blackouts. We had blackouts. And we had people that were assigned air wardens that walked the streets after dark, and you were not to have any light showing coming from your house. If you didn't have dark curtains that would keep the light from showing, you weren't to have lights on. These were, I was aware of the war and of listening to the radio and hearing news, but it didn't impact me that much. I think I was maybe about 8 years old. And I knew my brother was gone. He was serving in the Navy. But, and they used to have, they had POWs that used to work at Feeser's canning factory. I knew about them. I also knew that when the parades were in town, or a convoy would come through town, everybody would go down and stand along the street to watch a convoy go through town. And, but really that's all I saw of it. I remember we had a day, and I think it was Tuesday or Thursday, I'm not sure, where we did not eat meat. Sugar was rationed, and gasoline.
Now, the reason you didn't eat meat?
They just, I guess the government asked us not to eat meat so that the servicemen would have more meat to eat. But we did not eat meat one day of the week.
And you carried flowers in the parade?
Oh, yes. And on Memorial Day, when I was in elementary school, you were off from school. You never went to school. And you were provided with fresh flowers, and we marched through town and took them to the grave and put them on graves.
I understand that one of your other activities was swimming.
Oh, yes. I was a tomboy. There's a bunch of us used to go down. We didn't have any swimming pool or anything here, so we'd go down to the pump house. And it was, well, you could drive through one part of the creek. But then you went upstream a little further, and it got deeper where it got deep enough to swim. And that's where I learned to swim. I don't think my mother ever knew that. That's where I learned
Now,
to swim.
the pump house being at the end of Commerce Street.
Yes.
And down over the hill, and then I think it's blocked off now, but that was
Yeah.
where they called it the pump house because
I guess that's
where
where
the
they pumped
city's
the
water
water.
came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you and your friends swam in Piney Creek at the pump house.
Yes, that's right.
You didn't need a fancy swimming pool in those
No,
days.
no, we didn't even have, we just taught ourselves to swim.
How about do you remember the medical doctors in Taneytown in those days?
Yes, we had on Middle Street, there lived a Dr. Elliott. He was a medical doctor, and Dr. Benner was down across from Riffle's dry goods store, which is now, I think, the Hair Barn. He had an office there, and then Dr. McVall, he was across from the funeral parlor.
Did you go to any of those doctors?
Yeah, we went to Dr. McVall.
You went to Dr. McGraw?
Mhm.
Okay.
Dr. Benner was elderly at that time, and but he still had plenty of patients. A lot of people went to him. And Dr. Elliott had his office in his house. I went to Taneytown School from the first grade through the 11th. There were only 11 grades then, and graduated from there when I was 16.
Now that was in the days before the gym was built.
Oh yeah.
The cafeteria?
Cafeteria was converted to the gym when it was needed. And since I was a town student, I walked to school every morning, came home at lunchtime, ate lunch, and walked back to school. The only people that had bus transportation were rural students. And I think the new gym was built while I went there because I played basketball in the new gym.
Oh.
And they had what they called portables that they put up. For extra classes, I guess they had more students than they had anticipated, so they put up 2 portables outside. But I never had to go to school in a portable. It depended if you were academic or if you were a commercial student or a general student.
Okay.
And I think they stayed there for a long time. I was not here, I didn't live around here when they tore the high school down.
I might point out that this is the 50th celebration of the last graduating class from Taneytown High School this
Yeah.
year. Mm-hmm. You were able to enjoy the fairgrounds.
Oh yes, we went to the fair every year. That was a big occasion. It was located on the edge of town out here going towards Westminster. I guess it's where the shopping center is now. And I remember getting cotton candy, and a couple got married every year there one evening. and they had sulky races during the day. And of course everybody, my mother canned things and took there to be judged also. And that was located under the grandstand.
Oh, okay.
That was a big affair at that time.
And you remember Miller Clothing Store on the square?
Yeah, Mr. Miller had a clothing store where the dance studio is now, and Hesson's had a department store on the other corner. And of course, Mr. Leister had the hotel. That's always been on that corner. And the movie theater on the other corner. But when I lived up there, right next door to Mr. Miller, we lived in that house for a while, and part of that house. Anna Mary Sell, every summer, would set up a snowball stand and sell snowballs on the sidewalk. And that was a real treat. We loved that.
Oh.
So,
Hey, when you graduated from high school, you took on a working career. Can you tell us about some of the places you worked?
well, I was, as I said, I was 16 when I got out of high school. And I went to Baltimore to school to be a beautician. And when I came back, I worked for Mary Donatelli, who had been Mary Shum and her husband, who had a hair salon here in town. I worked for them for a while. I don't remember why I left there or if they closed the shop. And then I went to work for Sanitary Products, who was owned by Mr. Frank Parrish, who lived outside of Taneytown here.
The one in Thorndale?
Yes, at
Thorndale.
Mm-hmm.
And that was on the corner of Blue Ridge Avenue and York Street.
Yes, that's correct. I worked there. Then they closed that place. I don't know why, but they moved it to Walkersville. So I went to Walkersville and worked there until I got married. And I married an Army man, so after that I didn't work too much. I raised 3 children and traveled and lived lots of places over the world. And then when my husband retired, we came back here and built a house outside of town here. But
You worked a little bit at Model Steam Bakery?
well, that's after my children.
Oh,
were
after your
in
children were
school.
grown.
Yeah, I worked at Model Steam Bakery in Ladiesburg, and before that I worked part-time for Milt Krause, who had a small restaurant across from the rubber factory, and he was only open in the morning through noon. And I worked for Ed Bumgarner at Twin Kiss for a while. Well, let's see, where else did I work? I worked for George Root, a jewelry store. And I worked for Harry Doherty in later years. I mean, I worked for him worked for George Root quite a few years. I worked here and I worked in Mount Airy.
I guess we can point out that the Krause restaurant was on the corner of Riffles Alley and Blue Ridge Avenue.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It was
It's,
in an old shed or a barn or something that they had converted.
It's just an old garage today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then your husband was an electrician?
Yeah, my husband was a career Army man, and when he had served 20-some years, he decided to retire. And he was older than I, so we still had some young children when we came back here. So he, as I say, he worked for Dave Hildebrand for a while, quite a few years.
And that was Midtown Electric?
Yes, that was Midtown Electric. And then he went in business with Mr. Foreman from Hanover, and that didn't work out. So then he started his own business at our house, and it is and still is Monocacy Valley Electric, which is located right outside of Littlestown now, which my sons now are involved in and have been.
So you grew up in a simpler life in the city of Taneytown?
Oh yes, it was very much so.
Okay.
You could run around and play any place, and you could. Oh, I forgot to tell you, we used to go to Curdy Bear's store too.
Oh, yes.
That was a treat.
Curdy Bear's store is where I think the fire hall is now, the fire department.
Yes,
They tore
part
that
of it
down.
was there, yes, and the telephone exchange was upstairs, but that building has since been torn down along with Curdy Barris. But Curdy Barris was a great guy. He was really good with children, and he always had lots of patience with us, and he had all these candies in a glass case. And I didn't get an allowance, but I did go do some things for the lady next door, and she'd give me a nickel or something. Then I'd go to Curdy's and buy candy with it.
And Nickel bought a lot of candy.
Oh
those
yeah,
days.
yeah. I was rich. I had a nickel, and but he was always very patient, and he never hurried you, and he was, always talked to you. Everybody liked to go there, and I do remember on Halloween, everybody went out and trick or treated. And we didn't really have any boundaries. I think I stayed on Middle Street and went over on York Street and places like that. But, I mean, we were allowed to do that. There was one lady I know, she was elderly and she lived alone. We used to call her Minnie Ha Ha. But she didn't like kids trick-or-treating at her house. And the boys, they put some nasty things on her porch. And she'd come out and fuss at them. And we soaped windows. I know we used to soap car windows. And I don't think my father appreciated that either.
Oh, a little mischievous.
Yeah, we did do that. Yes, we did that.
Now, you had a little accident occurred at Byers' store, too.
Oh, yes. One day I was down there with my nickel. And they had glass cases. They had the glass case, and I was kind of short, I guess, and I wanted to see what was in there. So they were boxes with glass cases on the top with just a glass lid on. And my knee went through one of them, and I cut my knee pretty bad. I still have a scar from that today. But it was a nice life. It really was. Nobody had a lot of money, but everybody had enough of everything. I remember we moved with my grandmother on Middle Street. That's where we lived when I was in high school. And she was 93, and she had a double house, so she had rented half of it, and when she couldn't, when she was there by herself, I'd have to go down and sleep with her at night, stay with her so she wouldn't be alone. But eventually we moved down there, and we all lived together, and then she lived with us when my parents built their home until she passed away. But the nights I went down before we moved together, she used to tell me all kinds of things. She would tell me about the Civil War, about the guns that she could hear in Gettysburg and that they were farm people, and she said if you were a farmer, you didn't have to go to fight in the war. And but I mean, she was a wonderful woman, and she told me things, and she could do things that amazed me at the time. I thought there was nobody any smarter than this lady. But my sister was born with some kind of a skin disease, and they shaved her head and then brought her to my grandmother. And she took a silk thread and took it over her head and said words over it. And her skin disease was gone.
Wow.
She could also, if you burnt yourself, she would come and she'd say, come here, and she'd blow on it and repeat words. She was a very religious lady, so I mean, it was something from the Bible that she said. And the burn would be, you wouldn't feel it anymore.
Wow.
But I mean, I know she told me one time, she had chickens, we had chickens there, and we also had a wash house, and we had something, I guess it was a root cellar. It was a barrel buried in the ground, and they put vegetables in there to keep for the winter. Of course, we had a smokehouse, and there was always meat that hung in the smokehouse. In the wash house, they made homemade soap. They made apple butter in big black kettles. And we lived near the railroad up here, and any of the bums that walked on the railroad came by my grandmother's because she fed every one of them. They couldn't come in the house. They had to sit on the back porch, but she always fed every one of them. When I left here, when I married, I moved away. And eventually I lived in New York for 6 years. And what I missed when I was over there, I missed Taneytown. My mother would send me the Carroll Record all the time so I could keep up with what was going on. And that was a local newspaper. But what I missed the most was the red clay earth that we have around here. I miss seeing that.
Wow. We do have red,
Yeah.
red clay earth around here.
That's what I miss the most.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking with us this morning. And
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.